Hello, dreamers, and welcome back to the show. I want to thank you so much for your patience with me in recent weeks. Because of time running out last week and this week, I had a trip to California. I am getting used to this new computer that I have and everything. So I've decided to postpone episode 162, which is about half written, and I'm going to write and record this bonus instead. And all bonus means, usually, is that it might not be as long. These are typically stories that perhaps don't have that much detail or information that can be found online. The story might be older, or it may be breaking news, brand new stuff. And sometimes when these stories are unsolved because there's no trial or no resolution to the story, then I make those types of things into bonuses. So this is one of those stories that's older. It begins before the American Civil War. There is a decent amount of information online despite that, but it has a mysterious ending. So let's get into this bonus episode of California Dreaming, The Tale of Ambrose Bierce. A man stood upon a railroad bridge in northern Alabama, looking down into the swift water 20 feet below. The man's hands were behind his back, the wrists bound with a cord. A rope closely encircled his neck. It was attached to a stout cross timber above his head, and the slack fell to the level of his knees. Some of the loose boards laid upon the sleepers supporting the metals of the railway supplied a footing for him and his executioners. 2 private soldiers of the Federal Army, directed by a sergeant who in civil life may have been a deputy sheriff. At a short remove upon the same temporary platform was an officer in the uniform of his rank, armed. He was a captain. A sentinel at each end of the bridge stood with his rifle in the position known as support. That is to say, vertical, in front of the left shoulder, the hammer resting on the forearm, thrown across the chest, a formal and unnatural position, enforcing an erect carriage of the body. It did not appear to be the duty of these 2 men to know what was occurring at the center of the bridge. They merely blockaded the 2 ends of the foot planking that traversed it. Beyond one of the sentinels, nobody was in sight. The railroad ran straight away into a forest for 100 yards, then curving, was lost to view. Doubtless there was an outpost farther along. The other bank of the stream was open ground, a gentle acclivity topped with a stockade of vertical tree trunks, loopholed for rifles with a single embrasure through which protruded the muzzle of a brass cannon commanding the bridge. Midway of the slope between the bridge and the fort were the spectators. A single company of infantry in line at parade rest, the butts of the rifles on the ground, the barrels inclining slightly backwards against the right shoulder, the hands crossed upon the stock. A lieutenant stood at the right of the line, the point of his sword upon the ground, his left hand resting upon his right. Excepting the group of 4 at the center of the bridge, not a man moved. The company faced the bridge, staring stonily, motionless. The sentinels facing the banks of the stream might have been statues to adorn the bridge. The captain stood with folded arms, silent, observing the work of his subordinates, but making no sign. Death is a dignitary who, when he comes announced, is to be received with formal manifestations of respect, even by those most familiar with him. In the code of military etiquette, silence and fixity are forms of deference. That was the opening of a short story entitled An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, written in 1890 by Ambrose Bierce, a journalist, author, and American Civil War veteran. While Ambrose was a prolific and influential writer, often compared to Edgar Allan Poe because his writings were dark, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge is one of his best-known works. If you stay tuned to the end of this episode, I will read the rest of the short story for you in its entirety. He's been called one of the most idealistic men his generation produced. as well as the most complete literary failure of the century. He's been called a hideous monster, a pessimism machine, and a strange man. Ambrose Bierce was the 10th of 13 children, born on June 24, 1842, to parents Marcus and Laura Bierce. His birthplace was in a log cabin located along Horse Cave Creek in the state of Ohio. All of Ambrose's siblings' names began with the letter A, from oldest to youngest: Abigail, Amelia, Anne, Addison, Augustus, Imelda, Andrew, Albert, Ambrose, Arthur, Adelia, and Aurelia. The Bierce family were the proprietors of the largest library in the area, and this would lead Ambrose towards developing a deep passion for reading. The family library was his happy place. He read as many of his family's books as he possibly could. The classic novels were the ones he was drawn to the most, but Ambrose would basically read anything he could find, classic or otherwise. The thing that would drive a wedge between Ambrose and his family as he grew up would be religion, specifically the beliefs and teachings of Calvinism. I don't want to get too much into it, but Calvinism was a religion developed by French theologian John Calvin in the 16th century. It is a branch of Protestantism that adheres to Christian theology that came about during the Reformation era. But anyway, Ambrose would begin to reject the family's religious beliefs by the time he was a teen. And by the age of 15, he left home and never went back. He found work at an Indiana-based newspaper publication called the Northern Indiana, where he became a printer's apprentice. When Ambrose turned 17, he entered what was then Kentucky Military Institute, located in Linden, Kentucky, though there was also a location in Venice, Florida. Today, it is no longer a military prep school, as it was open from 1845 through 1971. Tuition had become largely unaffordable, and as you know, leading up to it shutting down in 1971, as the Vietnam War was in full swing, interest in joining the military had dropped off significantly. So, the military prep school saw its final graduating class of cadets in 1971 and shuttered its doors forever. The following year, the campus was renamed Kentucky Academy. It no longer had any military affiliation, and today it is a private kindergarten through 12th grade private school called Kentucky Country Day School. So Ambrose had spent a year at the Kentucky Military Institute, leaving the school in 1860. However, the campus had suffered a fire and all records of Ambrose's attendance at the academy were destroyed. As a result of that, it has never really been determined why he left the school early, though I don't know how long students needed to be in attendance in order to graduate. From there, Ambrose went back to Indiana, where he got a job at a restaurant located in the town of Elkhart. He was a waiter as well as a handyman. After that, he worked for some time in a brick manufacturing yard, which was hard labor and not exactly what Ambrose had really dreamed of doing with his life. While the exact origins of the American Civil War is debatable when it is considered why and when the Southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederacy, the war itself officially began on April 12, 1861, when Fort Sumter, located in Charleston, South Carolina, was attacked by the Confederate forces. The Confederacy wanted control of the fort that was considered to be part of their claim in the South, but the president at the time, James Buchanan, refused to turn the fort over to them. However, by the time the attack on Fort Sumter began, Abraham Lincoln had become president. After 3 days of unrelenting attack by the Confederate forces, the Union, who were outmanned and outgunned, abandoned the fort, and it was taken over by the Confederacy, and thus began the Civil War. President Lincoln, in the wake of the loss at Fort Sumter, requested the enlistment of 75,000 people to volunteer to join the Union forces. and Ambrose Bierce was one of them. He enlisted in the Army's 9th Indiana Regiment Company C. Incidentally, while the exact number of women who served in the American Civil War can't accurately be determined because they had to be disguised as men, it is estimated that somewhere between 400 and 800 women served on both the Union and Confederate sides. And one of those women, Dr. Mary Walker, was and is the only woman to ever be awarded the Medal of Honor out of the 3,500 that have been awarded. However, in 1917, her name was actually removed from the Medal of Honor roll along with 900 other recipients only 2 years before she died, but her name was reinstated in 1977. Anyway, Ambrose and his company were involved in the Union's first official military action in the Civil War, which took place at the Battle of Philippi in what is now the state of West Virginia. Ambrose also participated in the Battle of Laurel Mountain, the Battle of Rich Mountain, the Battle of Cheat Mountain, the Battle of Greenbrier River, the Battle of Camp Allegheny, the Battle of Shiloh, the Siege of Corinth, the Battle of Harryville, the Battle of Stones River, the Battle of Chickamauga, the Chattanooga Campaign, the Battle of Lookout Mountain, the Battle of Missionary Ridge, the Battle of Resaca, the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, the Atlanta Campaign, the Battle of Jonesboro, the Battle of Franklin, and the Battle of Nashville. Ambrose's experiences at war would later become the inspiration for many of his short stories, as well as a memoir that he penned. The battle that left an indelible mark on Ambrose, seemingly more so than any other he was involved in, was the Battle of Shiloh. In April of 1862, the Union Army, consisting of about 40,000 soldiers, was moving towards the south along the Tennessee River. But those in charge of the Army, Brigadier General William Sherman and Commander Ulysses S. Grant, they had no idea, nor were they ready for any sort of military confrontation with the Confederate Army, who outnumbered the Union by about 4,000 soldiers. They started in Mississippi. They made their way up north towards the west bank of the river where the Union soldiers had set up their camps. There had been an extremely strong thunderstorm, so the Union was taken completely by surprise, and it wasn't until Commander Grant began hearing gunfire some distance away when he realized something was going on. He sent some of his soldiers to go check on it, and among that group to investigate this gunfire was Ambrose, and this was a 10-mile or 16-kilometer journey by foot in a torrential downpour, ending up in what would be the Battle of Shiloh. Ambrose would write about this in his short story first published in 1881 entitled What I Saw at Shiloh. The opening line of the story reads, "This is a simple story of a battle, such a tale as may be told by a soldier who is no writer, to a reader who is no soldier." You can read the whole story on the Ambrose Bierce Project website at www.ambrosebierce.org. And I'll put the link in the show notes as well. When the battle was over, 3,000 soldiers had lost their lives, more than 7,000 were injured, and about 4,000 more were either missing or prisoners of war. The Union emerged from the Battle of Shiloh as the victors, but the price of the battle was steep. And the things that Ambrose lived through and witnessed at this battle in particular would consume him for the remainder of his days. During the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, Bierce was out of commission for about 3 months when in June of 1864, he suffered a fractured temporal bone as a result of a bullet fired by a Confederate sniper that hit him in the side of his head. It was an injury almost everybody thought was going to be fatal, but Ambrose managed to survive to fight another day. He went back on active duty in September, but ended up being honorably discharged from the Army 4 months later at the beginning of 1865, just about 4 months before the war officially ended following the surrender of Robert E. Lee on April 9, 1865. 5 days later, President Lincoln was shot by Southern sympathizer John Wilkes Booth and Lincoln died the following day. Anyway, Ambrose did not stay out of the military forever, as he always looked upon his time in the Union Army fondly. Not the war itself or the battles, but fighting alongside his fellow soldiers. Those were the memories that he chose to hold on to because they brought him a sense of peace and comfort. He went back sometime in July of 1866 to participate in some exploratory expeditions to review and oversee some military outposts, starting in Omaha, Nebraska, and then they headed west. During his time in the Civil War, Ambrose had become a cartographer, and his skills as such were needed for this journey. For his service, he was promised he would be promoted to the rank of captain, and by the end of 1866, Ambrose and the others that he was traveling with ended up in San Francisco, California. At the time, San Francisco boasted a growing population. By the time Ambrose arrived, there were about 100,000 people living there. And what set San Francisco apart from almost every other city in the West was its culture and artistic enlightenment. San Francisco was very different from the surrounding areas, and it was a bit more isolated from the outside world. It was a utopia if you were an artist or a musician or a writer or a creator of any kind. However, when Ambrose arrived at what was then the Presidio Army Base, where he was to receive his commission papers and promotion to captain, he was actually given the rank of second lieutenant, not the higher rank of captain that he'd been promised. This prompted Ambrose to resign from the army, and he would never return to serve in the United States military ever again. After having much difficulty finding work, Ambrose eventually landed a job working as a guard at the U.S. Mint, but he had the graveyard shift. While the job was as boring, mundane, and monotonous as it sounds, what it did enable Ambrose to do was to do what he loved the most, going back all the way to his childhood: reading. He continued plowing through books as he had done in his youth, and he worked on sharpening his skills as a writer. And he would go on to publish his very first work, a poem entitled Basilica, in a newspaper called The Californian, on September 21st, 1867. But because Ambrose was a relatively new writer, readers felt the work was amateurish and was heavily criticized. Though that would not stop him. 3 months later, in December of 1867, Ambrose published his first nonfiction work, also in the Californian, entitled Female Suffrage. The following year, he would publish 2 articles in 2 other publications, The Golden Era and The Newsletter. And from there, the Newsletter hired Ambrose that same year, and by the year's end, he'd been promoted to editor. Also that December, Ambrose met Mark Twain, who came by the offices of the Newsletter to pay back a loan that he'd owed. Ambrose was gaining quite a reputation for his writings for the Newsletter, all around San Francisco. He'd been a writer for a column in the Newsletter called The Town Crier. Apparently, it was like the TMZ of the 19th century. It was his job to expose, criticize, or even humiliate those who he felt deserved to be through his writings for the column. And readers apparently loved it, and they loved his no-holds-barred way of journalism. Because of his fearlessness of anything, anybody, or any entity, Ambrose eventually became known as the wickedest man in San Francisco. He also wrote several bigger pieces for a publication called the Overland Monthly, giving him more exposure to more readers and subscribers. In San Francisco, because of the nature of its culture and the community, Ambrose had the freedom to write about anything and everything he wanted to in any manner that he saw fit, and he pretty much became a local celebrity. And in addition to that, the ladies at the time found the war hero and journalist bachelor appealing as well. And then Ambrose met Molly Day, the daughter of a wealthy and successful gold miner. He was a 49er. Molly was smart, refined, cultured, and beautiful. Hers was one of the most prominent families in the San Francisco area. Ambrose courted Molly for a time, and eventually the couple wed on December 25th, 1871. For their honeymoon, they sailed to London, England. At the time, in London, American literature was quite popular. And while nobody in London had any idea who Ambrose Bierce was, he decided that he was going to make himself known. Because he knew deep down that he didn't want to be a journalist forever. He wanted to be remembered for great works of literature. Now, I can't say for sure if Ambrose and Molly returned to San Francisco after their honeymoon and decided to go back to London, or if they arrived in London for their honeymoon and just didn't go back to San Francisco at all. But on March 9th, 1872, Ambrose resigned from the newsletter and was officially moved to London with his new wife. And on December 18th, 1872, the first of the couple's 3 children was born in Bristol, England, where they had moved to from London. It was a son that they named Day, D-A-Y. That was Molly's maiden name. Molly's mom traveled to England from California to visit her daughter and new grandson, and Ambrose was apparently not very pleased to have his mother-in-law visiting. No matter, he focused on his writings, as earlier that summer in July of 1872, Ambrose had published his first book entitled Bean's Delight. You know, like Friends without the R, under the pseudonym Dodd Grile. It was a compilation of Ambrose's articles that he wrote for his Town Crier column back in San Francisco. Sometime during the winter months of 1873, Ambrose would meet up with Mark Twain again for a second time. They had dinner together, along with another American writer, poet, as well as a frontiersman named Joaquin Miller. And apparently, the dinner with the trio turned into quite a rowdy affair. At the same time, Mark Twain was kind of a rival of Ambrose's. At least that's how Ambrose saw it. However, in one of his articles, he had been extremely critical of Mark having married a woman who was the daughter of a very wealthy family, but Ambrose actually had done the same exact thing. An Ambrose Bierce scholar named S.T. Joshi said in an interview, quote, "He had a very tortured relationship with Mark Twain and expressed considerable envy and resentment that Twain had become more famous than he did for doing basically the same things. Writing journalism, writing humorous sketches, being a kind of celebrity of the West, especially in England. They were both in England in the 1870s, and it was Twain and others that were getting the notoriety, but not Bierce so much. And this tendency persisted throughout Bierce's life. I think he felt he deserved better. He wanted to be famous. He never really was famous. He called himself famously obscure, and you can tell that there is a certain bitterness in that." On April 29, 1874, Ambrose and Molly welcomed their second son, Lee, who had some health problems at the time of his birth. Molly's mom stayed with them in England until the baby was strong and healthy and finally went back to San Francisco, much to Ambrose's relief. Meanwhile, Ambrose was still actively writing and publishing various pieces for several publications in both England and in France. While he garnered a reputation for being a humorist in his writings, he didn't agree, seeing himself as more than that, edgier than just a funny writer. About this characterization of himself, Ambrose would write, quote, "Humor is tolerant, tender. Its ridicule caresses. Wit stabs, begs pardon, and then turns the weapon in the wound." Perhaps Ambrose was witty and humorous in his journalistic writings, but as demonstrated in his published literary works, he is not a humorist. It's quite the opposite. His literature was quite dark. By early 1875, Molly began growing weary living so far away from her family, so she took her 2 sons and went back to San Francisco that May. While she didn't know it at the time, well, if she did know, she didn't tell Ambrose, but she eventually told him that she was pregnant. 6 months after she had moved back, she broke the news to Ambrose and said that she was not coming back to England. So in October, he too moved back to San Francisco, but the timing was bad, as San Francisco's economy had fallen into a depression. His old boss at the newsletter told him that if he had ever come back stateside, that he could have his job back writing for the Town Crier. but because the economy was in shambles, it was not a promise that could be kept. Though Ambrose was able to sell a few articles, and he also wrote a book he entitled first The Cynic's Word Book, and then it was later retitled The Devil's Dictionary. And it is a collection of Ambrose's own take on the definition of various words, and it's a pretty entertaining read. A few examples: the definition of alone, being in bad company; April Fool, a March fool with another month added to his folly; birth, the first and dirtiest of disasters; circus, a place where ponies, horses, and elephants are permitted to see men, women, and children acting the fool; destiny, a tyrant's authority for crime, a fool's excuse for failure; distance, the only thing the rich are willing for the poor to call theirs and keep; dog, a kind of additional or subsidiary deity designed to catch the overflow and surplus of the world's worship. There are about 1,000 of Ambrose's own definitions of words, and I ended up purchasing the paperback on Amazon because I did find it pretty amusing. So anyway, back to the story. After being unable to get his job back at the newsletter, Ambrose ended up finding work at the Mint again. Then, on October 30th, 1875, Molly gave birth to their third child, a girl that they named Helen. Ambrose would never return to England again. It was a place that he had fallen in love with and he missed dearly. But shortly after Helen's birth, Ambrose started to become overwhelmed with all of the responsibilities that he'd now been saddled with when it came to his growing family, and he began to sink into a depression. To combat the dreary feelings, Ambrose began self-medicating with alcohol, a lot of it. Also, as a lifelong asthma sufferer, he and his family moved to San Rafael, California, about 18 miles or 29 kilometers north of San Francisco. Over the course of this portion of Ambrose's life, he would move several times to different cities and towns all around Northern California, but I'm not going to go through each one because he moved pretty frequently. Anyway, the air in San Rafael was apparently more suitable for somebody who has asthma. But Ambrose continued to struggle to find steady work to support his family, so whatever work he was offered, he took. Ambrose eventually got back into cartography when he was hired by a mining company out near the Dakota Territories, a place where many people were headed to seek fortune. It wasn't too long after that Ambrose was hired as an assistant editor at a brand new publication called The Argonaut. But he didn't get along very well with the publisher of the paper, a man named Frank Pixley. Frank envisioned the publication to be used as a weapon in the feuding between social classes, the upper class and the lower class. But Ambrose wanted the paper to be more focused on literature. Following that, Ambrose hatched another plan with a couple of his friends. It was a scheme, sort of, to not only try to make a good chunk of money, but they also hoped to make a name for themselves. Ambrose and two of his friends wrote a book. It wasn't nonfiction, technically. It was fiction, but it was written and meant to be interpreted by the reader as being nonfiction. In other words, the book was a hoax. The book they wrote, they used the pseudonym William Herman, and it was called The Dance of Death. In it, they made the claim that the waltz, the dance, the waltz, was nothing more than a conspiracy perpetrated in an effort to incite people to rebel against morality. But to bring about more attention and publicity for the book, Ambrose wrote a number of articles in various publications that heavily criticized it as being utterly ridiculous, that the waltz was nothing more than just a dance. The notion of it being some sort of hidden conspiracy was absurd at best. Essentially, Ambrose was denouncing his own book in the press. But local religious groups were buying into the premise of the book and endorsed its beliefs. As a result, people were coming in droves to get their hands on a copy of it, and it eventually sold about 18,000, which was huge for a small-time publishing company out west. But in spite of his success, Ambrose drew the ire of many involved in the world of journalism in San Francisco at the time. It was not uncommon for journalists to write scathing articles about people of wealth and power, but they also wrote about each other, their peers in journalism. And one of their favorite targets was Ambrose Bierce. It was common practice for newspaper editors to threaten each other, to challenge one another to a duel, to get into fights at local watering holes. And Ambrose's fearlessness in his writings did stand out, as he did not hold back in what he had to say about politicians or wealthy business people, which resulted in a lot of threats being hurled at Ambrose, either to sue him or to kill him. He eventually grew weary of his work in journalism in San Francisco and ended up heading east again to the Dakota Territory in 1880, working for the same employer who had hired him some years earlier as a cartographer. His job this time was to oversee an irrigation project for the dry land areas so those areas could be prospected. He was pretty much the foreperson of the project, and he was also responsible for transporting company funds, which came in the form of gold. Well, while Ambrose was traveling through the Black Hills, sitting next to him was an armed guard that Ambrose had hired. And he hired the guy knowing that he was a man already under indictment for murder, but he gave him the job anyway. Well, as they were making their way through the hills with their horses and stagecoach, a man tried to rob them. But as soon as Ambrose realized what had happened, his security guard grabbed his rifle and shot and killed the guy. The owners of the mining company were not too keen on the guy that Ambrose had decided to hire as his security detail, considering when he wrote the man's name down on the payroll ledger, Ambrose listed his position with the company as murderer. As it were, the mining company was already in financial dire straits, so Ambrose ended up back in San Francisco, feeling worse than he had before he had left. And his old job at the Argonaut, they told him to find work elsewhere. And he did, eventually finding work with one of their competitors, a publication called The Wasp, which was a newspaper that was anti-railroad industry. And Ambrose's reputation as a local journalist in San Francisco, but also a creator of dark fiction, poems, and short stories, continued to grow. He eventually became the editor of The Wasp, but once the paper was sold, his job was lost. However, he still occasionally contributed articles, though his last published piece with the paper would be in September of 1886. Over the course of the next several months, Ambrose was unemployed, and he bounced around from town to town in and around the Bay Area. Then one day in the spring of 1887, I read in one place that it was in March and in another that it was in April, but either way, Ambrose was asleep at home one morning when he got a knock at the door, which got him out of bed. When Ambrose opened the door, the man standing there and explained that he was with the San Francisco Examiner. Ambrose asked if he was sent by William Randolph Hearst, but he politely informed him that he was, in fact, William Randolph Hearst. Many of you may know or at least have heard of the name William Randolph Hearst. You've probably heard of the Hearst Castle. You've also heard of Patty Hearst. William Randolph Hearst obviously was the publisher of the Examiner, which was a thing gifted to him by his father, Senator George Hearst. He was a businessman and a politician. He was a member of the House of Representatives, having been elected twice. He ran for president in 1904. He ran for mayor of New York City in 1905 and 1909. And he ran for New York governor in 1906, but all of those bids were unsuccessful. He was also the grandfather of Patty Hearst, who was either a member of the Siboney's Liberation Army or, as she alleges, she was kidnapped by the group and ordered to commit crimes with them, including a bank robbery. She was convicted and sentenced, but eventually President Jimmy Carter commuted her sentence, and then President Bill Clinton subsequently pardoned her completely. Anyway, William Hearst being on Ambrose's front porch was kind of a big deal. When William was given control over the newspaper, it had a pretty substantial circulation in San Francisco, but he envisioned more for the publication. He wanted it to be edgier, to take more chances, to be more controversial in order to increase its circulation. At the same time, Hearst wanted the paper to maintain its journalistic integrity, but just for its articles to be written without inhibition. So his first matter of business was to put together a conglomeration of writers who were the best of the best in order to see what he wanted for the paper to come to fruition, which is how he ended up knocking on Ambrose's door that morning. Of course, having been down and out, unemployed, broke, and sad, Ambrose jumped at the chance to write for the Examiner. It was exactly what he needed at exactly the right time. He was drowning, and Hearst had tossed him a lifesaver. Aside from that, it was hugely flattering for Ambrose to have this young, wealthy, up-and-comer tapping him for his services and writing skills. And Ambrose's star would shine bright at the Examiner over the course of the next 5 to 6 years. He would publish some of his best pieces for the Examiner. Readers were especially taken with the stories that he wrote about his experiences in the Civil War. Most of the time, Ambrose wrote at home, beginning at sunrise all the way until sunset, and then by candlelight if need be. And it was said in his documentary that next to him, where he sat writing, he kept a skull. A real skull. Rumors have said that it belonged to a friend of his. Other rumors have said that it was an enemy. Either way, the thing came from some human being. While Ambrose's professional life was soaring high, his personal life was in shambles. He was kind of a deadbeat dad and husband. He wasn't around much for his kids. As a matter of fact, his writings reflected his true feelings, which were largely chauvinistic when it came to spousal roles in marriage. And Molly, having pretty much been on her own, no Ambrose around for any consistent amount of time, eventually met and was courted by another man, a dashing Danish man who lived near the area where Ambrose had set his wife and kids up with a place to live, but was never there himself. This Danish guy took notice of the beautiful young mother and quickly became enamored with her. However, there was an occasion when Ambrose randomly showed up, a thing that didn't happen very often, and he discovered a collection of love letters that Molly had received from the Dane, which caused him to become enraged. Ambrose gathered his belongings that he had left at Molly's house and walked out on his wife and children. Not that he was there much to begin with, but this would be the last time. He'd never be coming back. This was sometime in 1888. So going back about a year, sometime in 1887, Molly and Ambrose's oldest son, Day, had decided he no longer wanted to be in school. He was ready to begin his own career and follow in his father's footsteps. He wanted to get into journalism. Eventually, when Day was 17, he met and fell pretty hard for a young lady named Eva Adkins. She worked at a cannery in the city of Chico, California. While Day and Eva were not in any sort of committed relationship, he did try hard to win her affections, even going so far as to quit the job he had found as a journalist and began working at the cannery as well. But Day's feelings for Eva went beyond just a crush or puppy love. He seemed to have become quite obsessed and possessive, even though there was nothing between them, as she did not reciprocate the feelings. To make matters worse, she began seeing another man who had been a friend of hers, and it sort of blossomed into a romance, a gentleman by the name of Neil Hubbs. Eventually, the couple quietly eloped. But that news would not stay quiet for long. You see, Eva lived in a boarding house that her mother owned, and Day rented a room in the place too. So when she and her new husband returned, and it was announced that they had gotten married, Day, feeling spurned by the woman he loved, became overcome with anger and rage. He had a gun, and he grabbed it, and he opened fire, first shooting Neil. Then he shot Eva in the head right behind her ear. While the couple were seriously wounded, they weren't giving up. Neil was able to get up. He tussled with Day over the gun, and he managed to get it away from him, at which point he and Eva fled the scene. Day, still completely enraged and distraught, went to his bedroom, where he apparently kept a stash of chloroform. And well, we are true crime enthusiasts and we know what chloroform is used for in crimes, but as a regular household chemical, its uses could be quite innocuous, I guess. But Day had his chloroform. He soaked a rag with it, placed it over his face, and then took another gun that he had and shot himself in the head. Both Neil and Day lived for a few days after they'd been shot, but both of them eventually succumbed to their wounds. In 1891, Ambrose published his very first book of fiction that would have the short stories he would become best known for, entitled The Tales of Soldiers and Civilians. The book received rave reviews from critics for its bold progressiveness. And the most popular story in the book was the one that I opened this episode with, and the one that I will finish reading to you at the end of this, An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge. It's become his most well-known story because it was fiction, but it felt real with a supernatural twist. It blends the Civil War with psychological horror, and it hits the nail on the head when it comes to understanding what is going on in the mind of someone who is in a tremendously precarious situation. Expressing feelings, expressing thoughts from the perspective of someone who's about to die, Ambrose Bierce was masterful at capturing that in his writings. The man who wrote The Red Badge of Courage, which was published in its entirety in 1895, described Ambrose Bierce as one of his influences and said that An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge had everything, that nothing better exists. An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge was first made into a movie in 1929, and then again in 1963, with the 1963 version winning an award at the Cannes Film Festival for Best Short Subject Film and an Academy Award for Best Live Action Short Film. The story was also made into an episode of The Twilight Zone. In October of 1892, Ambrose rewrote a long story that he translated from German, originally written by Adolf Danziger, entitled The Monk and the Hangman's Daughter. And this would be the closest Ambrose ever got to writing anything long enough to qualify as a novel. In December of 1893, he published his second fiction book entitled Can Such Things Be? But this was not as well received by all the critics, describing the stories in the book as extremely morbid, too morbid. At the same time, while Ambrose was writing, he was also a critic himself, and he was very much feared by authors of the time, because if Ambrose Bierce gave your published work a bad review, it could severely damage your career. One author in particular asked Ambrose for a critique of her book and for it to be only one sentence in length. Ambrose wrote, quote, "The covers of this book are too far apart." In January of 1896, Ambrose's boss, William Hearst, sent him to Washington, D.C. to lobby against a bill that would either help fund the railroads, but also at the same time excuse a large debt owed to the U.S. government by Collis P. Huntington, the same person who introduced the bill and was the last of the railroad barons that Ambrose had long rallied against and openly criticized in his writings. Now, at first, railroads were pretty successful. It enabled the transport and travel of goods from the east to the west as people were headed in that direction. But railroad companies began to face opposition from turnpike operators, canal construction companies, stagecoach manufacturers, as well as companies that operated wagons. And businesses along the way, innkeepers and taverns, they depended on those who traveled by stagecoach and wagon. The owners of those businesses were seeing their livelihoods threatened by railroads too. But eventually, when it came to the railroads, the pros outnumbered the cons, and the critics gave up. But anyway, what Hearst wanted Bierce to do was muckraking, which, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, when an American writer identified with the pre-World War I reform and expose literature. They provided detailed and accurate accounts of the political and economic corruption and social hardships caused by the power of the barons of big business in the United States, which was rapidly industrializing at the time. Ambrose's efforts caused this bill to fail to pass, and his last words written about Huntington, Ambrose said, quote, "He deserves to hang from every branch of every tree of every state and territory penetrated by his railroads, with the sole exception of Nevada, which has no trees." Ambrose's efforts in Washington and his successful muckraking of Huntington and causing his bill to fail to be passed, Huntington had tried to bribe him even on the steps of Congress, telling Ambrose to name his price. Everybody has a price. And Ambrose basically told him $75 million made payable to the U.S. government. Clearly that was not going to happen, as Huntington was hoping for that debt to be wiped out by the bill. When Ambrose arrived back in California, he was hailed as a local hero for managing to shut down big business with his witty yet scathing articles. In 1901, there was another tragic loss in Ambrose's life. His second son, Lee. He had become quite the reporter. He too was up and coming for the Los Angeles Reporter, and after that he had gone to work for the New York Telegraph. Now Lee, unlike his older brother Day, did not have the same fiery temper that his father and brother did, but he did inherit his father's penchant for excessive drinking. On an evening in March of 1901, Lee was out drinking on a night that was extremely chilly, and he became very sick due to exposure to the cold. His condition was grave, but he did ask to see his sister Helen. And Ambrose contacted her by wire, but she was across the country in Los Angeles, so there was little she could do. On March 31st, 1901, Lee passed away of complications related to pneumonia. He was only 26 years old. And now Ambrose has lost both of his sons, 2 out of his 3 children preceding him in death. But Ambrose carried on. Later on in 1901, he had traveled to Washington, D.C. again because President Teddy Roosevelt wanted to meet him. Roosevelt had been inspired by a short story that he had written entitled The Son of the Gods. Roosevelt also had a connection to Ambrose's boss, William Hearst. Remember, I mentioned that Hearst had run for governor of New York and lost, as well as several other offices. Well, apparently Roosevelt had a hand in thwarting his bid for office by starting a rumor that Hearst had been the one that instigated President William McKinley's assassination in 1901, at which point is when Roosevelt ascended to the office of the presidency. Ambrose had written an article in the San Francisco Examiner about the governor of Kentucky, William Goebel, who had been assassinated, and he followed that up by writing that President McKinley would be next. And as sure as the day is long, McKinley was assassinated on September 14th, 1901, a year and 9 months after Governor Goebel was. So since it was Ambrose, one of Hearst's journalists, that had all but predicted the assassination of President McKinley, Hearst's political enemies used that against him, which is why so many of his political bids were unsuccessful. So back to Ambrose's crumbling personal life. Molly, well, she ended up filing for divorce in December of 1904, and by this time she was living in Los Angeles. But she filed for divorce thinking that Ambrose wanted to get married to someone else, but this was not the case. And then shortly after the divorce was finalized, Molly passed away. An article from the Los Angeles Herald is posted on Molly's Find a Grave page that reads, quote, "Former wife of Ambrose Bierce dies suddenly. Secured a divorce in local court only a few weeks ago. Mrs. Mary E. Bierce, former wife of Ambrose Bierce, the author and journalist, died of heart trouble yesterday morning in her home at 1032 South Figueroa Street. With her at the time of her death was her only daughter, Mrs. Samuel Ballard of Washington, D.C., who arrived in Los Angeles on Sunday for a visit with her mother. Until last Friday, Mrs. Bierce was in good health and her death came without warning. A brother, James Day, who resides in Los Angeles, is out of the city and has not been notified. Mrs. Bierce about 2 months ago got a divorce from her husband in the local courts. Relatives have been notified, and it is possible that the remains will be taken east for interment. Incidentally, dreamers, Helen, Molly and Ambrose's only surviving daughter, would live until 1940. On April 18, 1906, at 5:12 in the morning, a massive earthquake struck, its epicenter being close to San Francisco. While the exact magnitude of the quake can't be known, based on the destruction that it caused, it's been estimated to have been about a 7.9 on the Richter scale. The Richter scale would not be developed until about 30 years later. A 7.9 is listed as being a major earthquake, and an 8.0 is considered a great quake. An 8.0 can level entire communities surrounding the epicenter, which is precisely what happened to the city of San Francisco. According to earthquake.usgs.gov, this quake continues to rank as one of the most significant earthquakes of all times. As the shaking began, strong, violent shocks added to it, with the quake lasting anywhere from 45 to 60 seconds. It was felt as far and wide as Southern Oregon, all the way south to Los Angeles, and as far east as central Nevada. The quake itself was disastrous, but what came next destroyed what the earthquake hadn't: fires. It's been estimated that the fires would ultimately be responsible for upwards of 90% of the damage to the city. There were gas mains that ruptured, which caused nearly 36 fires, and those ultimately decimated almost 500 city blocks and tens of thousands of structures. Making matters worse, firefighters were using dynamite to knock down damaged structures in order to create fire breaks to slow the spread, but all that did was cause more fires, ironically, as the firefighters were not trained in using dynamite safely. Compounding things even more so, San Francisco's fire chief, the person who would have been in charge of the firefighting efforts, himself was killed in the earthquake, so essentially there was nobody in charge. And it was common practice at the time for insurance companies to pay out its clients for damages to their properties caused by fires. However, this would not be the case for properties that suffered earthquake damage. So naturally, the insured customers were claiming their properties were destroyed by fires, even going so far as to set fire to their quake-ravaged properties so they would be able to make a claim on their insurance. And it seemed as though some firefighters were holding off from putting out the flames since homeowners were torching their own houses. The Great San Francisco Earthquake of 1906 claimed more than 3,000 lives. 498 of those deaths were in San Francisco, 64 of them in Santa Rosa, 102 deaths in San Jose. The population of San Francisco at the time was approximately 400,000. 225,000 people were left homeless, 28,000 buildings were destroyed, and the total loss in 1906 dollars was estimated to be in the ballpark of $400 million, which when I put that into the inflation calculator, it would be equivalent to $11,522,175,128.42. The quake by itself caused an estimated $80 million in damages in 1906 money, or $2,304,435,025.86. Among the buildings that were destroyed by the earthquake or fires was the Hearst Building. Over the next several years, following the tragedy in San Francisco, Ambrose had quit working for Hearst, but he would come back, and this happened on a number of occasions. Something would cause him to become upset, he'd quit, then he'd come back. Eventually, he quit working for the Examiner for good, but he did take a job with another publication owned by Hearst, Cosmopolitan magazine, where he wrote a monthly column. But it was becoming more apparent that Ambrose and his style were a bit old-fashioned for the magazine that had a staff of employees and journalists half his age. So he resigned from Cosmopolitan in 1908 and decided the thing he wanted to do next was to publish all of his works to be included in what would end up amounting to 12 volumes, a project that began in 1909 and was completed in 1912. During this time, Ambrose did some traveling as well. He stopped back in California in 1910. He is said to have had a legendary drinking bout with novelist and journalist Jack London. The two men weren't terribly fond of each other, so a crowd gathered round to watch the drinking duel. But it wasn't as contentious as onlookers had hoped, as Ambrose did extend his hand to Jack London, despite their differences, because he knew that Jack London's young son had recently died. They pushed through their animosity and shook hands. After all, Ambrose had a deep understanding of what it meant to lose a child, ×2 in his case. This visit was the first time that Ambrose had been back since before the great earthquake and fire, and while much of San Francisco had been rebuilt, it was nothing like Ambrose had remembered it. Nothing like the city that he'd once loved. And it was the first time that people who knew Ambrose noticed how much he had aged. While Ambrose was in California on this particular visit, he had received word that Mark Twain had passed away on April 21st, 1910. The men had never been all that close. They were more frenemies, if nothing else. But it really struck Ambrose that maybe this, along with the changing landscape of San Francisco, was a sign that perhaps his time was running out, or at the very least, time was getting away from him. From there, Ambrose went back to Washington, D.C., and then it was there he got more bad news that a good friend of his, Percival Pollard, a journalist, author, and literary critic, had also died. Then in June of 1912, Ambrose returned to California for what would end up being his final visit. Sailing from New York to California, he would pass through the Panama Canal, which was still under construction at the time and not officially opened. And it was a sight that truly amazed him. He was docked there for about 3 days before making his way out the other side into the Pacific Ocean. The size and magnitude of the canal was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. And in case you are not too familiar with the Panama Canal, it is a human-made water passage in Panama that links the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. It bisects the Isthmus of Panama and is utilized for seafaring trade. France had originally begun the work on the canal about 30-plus years before it opened in 1881, but they halted the work due to both logistical and engineering issues, as well as a high number of deaths of workers constructing the canal. So the United States picked up where France had left off sometime in 1904, and after 10 years of building the 51-mile or 82-kilometer waterway, it was finally opened in 1914. And with it now open, it greatly cut down the amount of time it took for ships to get back and forth between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Before the canal, the trip around the southern tip of South America was 7,900 miles or 12,713 kilometers, so it was a big deal and a big time saver. And if you remember, if you're on Patreon and you listen to the tale of Donald Crowhurst, the man who joined that British sailing race around the world, one of the most treacherous passages with the strongest currents on the planet is down there around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America. So not only was it a massive time saver, it also spared ships that added hazard as well. The route of that race around the world did not allow for sailors to go through the canal. They had to go around Cape Horn. But anyway, at some point, Ambrose ended up back on the East Coast, in Washington, D.C. specifically, and it was from there he wrote a letter to his niece telling her that he was going to head to Mexico. And he was telling people that he was going to fight with Pancho Villa, or die trying, as he is reported to have said. Pancho Villa was a prominent general in the Mexican Revolution. So with that, on October 12, 1913, Ambrose departed from Washington, D.C. by train and headed to Mexico to fight, apparently, at the age of 71. The following day, on October 3rd, Ambrose arrived in Chattanooga, Tennessee, where he spent some time visiting several Civil War battlegrounds. On October 24th, 1913, he arrived in New Orleans, Louisiana. It was there he gave an interview to a reporter where among the things he was quoted as saying was, "I'm on my way to Mexico because I like the game." 3 days later, Ambrose arrived in San Antonio, Texas, and visited Fort Sam Houston. 10 days later, he wrote a letter to his niece dated November 6, 1913. He was in Laredo, Texas at the time, but in it he told her that he didn't know where he shall be next. But it doesn't matter much. Adios. While there, Ambrose visited Fort McIntosh along the Rio Grande. Don't forget, Ambrose was a Civil War veteran on top of everything else that he was, so he was treated with a great deal of respect and honor as he made these visits to these forts. On November 28, 1913, Ambrose crossed the international border at a bridge that linked El Paso, Texas to Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. He was said to have had about $2,000 in gold, but the exact amount he had varies depending on who you're talking to. Almost a month later, on December 26, 1913, Ambrose wrote a letter from Chihuahua, Mexico to his secretary and caregiver, Carrie Christensen, telling her that he was expecting to be on the move again the following day to Ojinaga, a town in Chihuahua, that Pancho Villa and his troops were staged, prepared to attack the Mexican federal troops. This letter would be the last time anyone ever heard from Ambrose Bierce and what became of him. To this day, his whereabouts is a mystery. It's a mystery with a number of theories. Nobody questions that Ambrose went to Mexico to seek adventure. That was his motivation, if he did in fact go to Mexico. But where he went from there can only be speculated upon. There are those who believe that what was written in his final letter, that he was preparing to go to battle in the Mexican Revolution alongside Pancho Villa to capture Ojinaga, that it was during that battle, which was one that Villa was victorious, it was there that Ambrose was killed. But it has also been speculated that perhaps he survived that battle and was subsequently killed in the Battle of Tarrion. But that battle seems to have taken place before the Battle of Ojinaga, so it seems to be less likely since the dates are slightly off. Not by much, just a couple of months, but still. From what I've read, the Battle of Tarrion occurred shortly before Ambrose arrived in Mexico. Adolf Danziger, the man whose book, The Monk and the Hangman's Daughter, that Ambrose had translated into English from German, claimed years later in 1929 that he actually spoke to Pancho Villa personally, that Villa granted him an interview and that he told Danziger that he threw Ambrose out of town because he made a threat about aligning himself with one of Villa's rivals. And eventually he either ordered Ambrose to be shot or Villa shot him himself because he drank way too much tequila. He then left Ambrose's body out in the open to be done away with by birds of prey. However, Danziger, having a largely spotty relationship with Ambrose, as well as a spotty relationship with the truth, is not thought to be all that credible. On April 27, 1919, the Washington Post published a story that said Ambrose was found wandering around a Mexican convoy armed with machine guns, and that Ambrose, along with the Mexican general, were shot and buried along a desolate trail. The New York World wrote an article that Helen, Ambrose's daughter, had received a letter from him, and in this letter he said that he was actually in France and that he was working for Lord Herbert Kitchener, 1st Earl of Kitchener, who was a senior British Army officer with whom Ambrose had communicated with in the past about military procedures and strategies. However, Helen would say she never received such a letter from her dad, that the article in the Washington Post was wrong. A Bierce biographer had said that he was told by a friend that was a resident of Mexico that he had seen a painting of Ambrose in his office and told his friend that he knew him. He said that by 1918, Ambrose was living in San Luis Potosi and that they called him Don Ambrosio, and that his plan was to lay low for a while, to have people think that he was dead, and then suddenly reappear, supposedly rising from the dead, so to speak, and to stun the world. Hopefully nobody was holding their breath because Ambrose has yet to stun anybody. Another story about Ambrose's fate came from a gentleman by the name of Edward Tex O'Reilly, who was also a soldier and a writer. He said that while he was in the border city of El Paso, Texas, collecting provisions for Pancho Villa and his soldiers, he communicated with Ambrose, sort of. Some reporters for the local papers told him that Ambrose was in town and was interested in meeting with Pancho Villa. The hotel clerk gave Tex a note that was purportedly from Ambrose, telling Tex that he would like to get together, but Ambrose never showed up. A couple of days later, Tex heard about an old American who had died in Sierra Mojada in the Mexican state of Coahuila. The old man had arrived in town by himself, and he apparently stayed with Mexican federal soldiers, apparently unaware that they were Pancho Villa's enemies. Ambrose was apparently asking a bunch of questions about nearby trails, and he was using his cartography skills to create maps of the area, and he supposedly told the federal troops that he was trying to get to where Villa and his troops were located. So the Mexican federal soldiers began to suspect that Ambrose was a spy, therefore they shot and killed him. By the time Tex arrived in Coahuila, Ambrose was already dead. He had missed him by about a week. Tex was shown where Ambrose was buried, which was in a plot near a wall made out of adobe in a small cemetery. Tex said he found a piece of wood using a hot iron. He burned Ambrose's name into it and erected this headstone of sorts next to where he was told Ambrose was laid to rest. None of this, though, could be substantiated. Another theory was that Ambrose took his own life. He was known to carry an old revolver that a friend had given him, and that it was possible he used it to commit suicide. A friend had said that there was a time when Ambrose showed him a place located at the Grand Canyon where if he decided to end his life, it would be in this specific place where he would be protected from birds of prey once he was dead. There was yet another theory that Ambrose had paired up with a man named A. Mitchell Hedges, who was an adventurer, a traveler, and an author. He's also been rumored to have been the inspiration for the Indiana Jones movie series, but he's best known for having found the Mitchell Hedges crystal skull in 1924 in what is today Belize. But there are records of Mitchell Hedges actually having bought a skull at an auction almost 20 years later, which put into question several of his other supposed discoveries. These crystal skulls, and that's another story for another day, but many of these things are said to not be authentic. Anyway, rumor has it that Ambrose fought alongside Mitchell Hedges for Pancho Villa for about 10 months. From there, the two of them traveled to South America, where they surveyed the German forces just before the start of World War I. And then it was said that Ambrose next went to Europe for a period of time, then eventually came back to South America, and he subsequently passed away in Panama at some point. The first person to raise the alarm about Ambrose's disappearance was his assistant and caretaker, Carrie Christensen. She wrote a letter to the U.S. consulate in Chihuahua City, Mexico. His response to the letter was that he was aware of every American that came to Chihuahua, and he was unaware of Ambrose Bierce being one of them. In 1914, Ambrose's daughter launched an investigation into her father's disappearance, as did the Secretary of the Interior at the time, Franklin Lane, but everything was a dead end. There was never any evidence that Ambrose Bierce ever went to Mexico. And on the flip side of that, there is no evidence that he didn't go either. Ambrose spent his life trying to make a name for himself, to be remembered like Twain and Poe. And perhaps the best and only way that he thought he would ever be able to overshadow the literary greats of his time was to ensure his fate would be an enduring mystery. Thank you so much for listening. If you would like to hear the reading of An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, stay tuned. Otherwise, I'm your host, Roseanne. Until next time, sweet dreams. A man stood upon a railroad bridge in northern Alabama, looking down into the swift water 20 feet below. The man's hands were behind his back, the wrist bound with a cord. A rope closely encircled his neck. It was attached to a stout cross timber above his head, and the slack fell to the level of his knees. Some loose boards laid upon the sleeper supporting the metals of the railway supplied a footing for him and his executioners. 2 private soldiers of the Federal Army, directed by a sergeant who in civilian life may have been a deputy sheriff. At a short remove upon the same temporary platform was an officer in uniform of his rank, armed. He was a captain. A sentinel at each end of the bridge stood with his rifle in the position known as support, that is to say, vertical in front of the left shoulder, the hammer resting on the forearm thrown straight across the chest. A formal and unnatural position, enforcing an erect carriage of the body. It did not appear the duty of these 2 men to know what was occurring at the center of the bridge. They merely blockaded the 2 ends of the foot planking that traversed it. Beyond one of the sentinels, nobody was in sight. The railroad ran straight away into a forest for 100 yards, then curving, was lost to view. Doubtless there was an outpost farther along. The other bank of the stream was open ground, a gentle acclivity topped with a stockade of vertical tree trunks, loopholed for rifles, with a single embrasure through which protruded the muzzle of a brass cannon commanding the bridge. Midway of the slope between the bridge and fort were spectators. A single company of infantry in line, at parade rest, the butts of their rifles on the ground, the barrels inclining slightly backward against the right shoulder, the hands crossed upon the stock. A lieutenant stood at the right of the line, the point of his sword on the ground, his left hand resting upon his right. Excepting the group of 4 at the center of the bridge, not a man moved. The company faced the bridge, staring stonily, motionless. The sentinels, facing the banks of the stream, might have been statues to adorn the bridge. The captain stood with folded arms, silent, observing the work of his subordinates, but making no sign. Death is a dignitary who, when he comes announced, is to be received with formal manifestations of respect, even by those most familiar with him. In the code of military etiquette, silence and fixity are forms of deference. The man who was engaged in being hanged was apparently about 35 years of age. He was a civilian, if one might judge from his habit, which was that of a planter. His features were good, a straight nose, firm mouth, broad forehead, from which his long dark hair was combed straight back, falling behind his ears to the collar of his well-fitting frock coat. He wore a mustache and a pointed beard, but no whiskers. His eyes were large and dark gray, and had a kindly expression which one would hardly have expected in one whose neck was in the hemp. Evidently, this was no vulgar assassin. The liberal military code makes provision for hanging many kinds of persons, and gentlemen are not excluded. The preparations being complete, the 2 private soldiers stepped aside, and each drew away the plank upon which he had been standing. The sergeant turned to the captain, saluted, and placed himself immediately behind that officer, who in turn moved apart 1 pace. These movements left the condemned man and the sergeant standing alone on the 2 ends of the same plank, which spanned 3 of the cross ties of the bridge. The end upon which the civilian stood almost but not quite reached a 4th. This plank had been held in place by the weight of the captain. It was now held by that of the sergeant. At a signal from the former, the latter would step aside. The plank would tilt, and the condemned man go down between 2 ties. The arrangement commended itself to his judgment as simple and effective. His face had not been covered, nor his eyes bandaged. He looked a moment at his unsteadfast footing, then let his gaze wander to the swirling water of the stream racing madly beneath his feet. A piece of dancing driftwood caught his attention, and his eyes followed it down the current. How slowly it appeared to move. What a sluggish stream. He closed his eyes in order to fix his last thoughts upon his wife and children. The water, touched to gold by the early sun, the brooding mists under the banks at some distance down the stream, the fort, the soldiers, that piece of drift, all distracted him. And now he became conscious of a new disturbance. Striking through the thought of his dear ones was a sound which he could not neither ignore nor understand. A sharp, distinct, metallic percussion, like the stroke of a blacksmith's hammer upon the anvil. It had the same ringing quality. He wondered what it was, and whether immeasurable distant or nearby. It seemed both. Its recurrence was regular, but as slow as the tolling of a death knell. He awaited each stroke with impatience, and, he knew not why, apprehension. The intervals of silence grew progressively longer, and the delays became maddening. With their greater infrequency, the sounds increased in strength and sharpness. They hurt his ear like the thrust of a knife. He feared he would shriek. What he heard was the ticking of his watch. He unclosed his eyes and saw again the water below him. If I could free my hands, he thought, I might throw off the noose and spring into the stream. By diving, I could evade the bullets and, swimming vigorously, reach the bank, take to the woods, and get away home. My home, thank God, is as yet outside their lines. My wife, my little ones, are still beyond the invaders' farthest advance. And these thoughts, which have here to be set down in words, were flashed into the doomed man's brain, rather than evolved from it. The captain nodded to the sergeant. The sergeant stepped aside. Peyton Farquhar was a well-to-do planter of an old and highly respected Alabama family. Being a slave owner, and like other slave owners, a politician, he was naturally an original secessionist and ardently devoted to the Southern cause. Circumstances of an imperious nature, which it is unnecessary to relate here, had prevented him from taking service with the gallant army that had fought the disastrous campaigns ending with the fall of Corinth, and he chafed under the inglorious resistance, longing for the release of his energies, the larger life of the soldier, the opportunity for distinction. That opportunity he felt would come, as it comes to all in wartime. Meanwhile, he did what he could. No service was too humble for him to perform in aid of the South, no adventure too perilous for him to undertake, if consistent with the character of a civilian who was at heart a soldier, and who in good faith and without too much qualification assented to at least a part of the frankly villainous dictum that all is fair in love and war. One evening, while Farquhar and his wife were sitting on a rustic bench near the entrance of his grounds, a gray-clad soldier rode up to the gate and asked for a drink of water. Mrs. Farquhar was only too happy to serve him with her own white hands. While she was fetching the water, her husband approached the dusty horseman and inquired eagerly for news from the front. "The Yanks are repairing the railroads," said the man, "and are getting ready for another advance. They have reached the Owl Creek Bridge, put it in order to build a stockade on the north bank. The commandant has issued an order, which is posted everywhere, declaring that any civilian caught interfering with the railroads, its bridges, tunnels, or trains will be summarily hanged. I saw the order." "How far is the Owl Creek Bridge?" Farquhar asked. "About 30 miles. "Is there no force on the side of the creek?" "Only a picket post a half-mile out on the railroad, a single sentinel at the end of this bridge." "Suppose a man, a civilian and student of hanging, should elude the picket post and perhaps get the better of the sentinel," said Farquhar, smiling. "What would be accomplished?" The soldier reflected. "I was there a month ago," he replied. "I observed how the flood of the last winter had lodged a great quantity of driftwood against the wooden pier at this end of the bridge. It is dry now and would burn like tow." The lady had now brought the water, which the soldier drank. he thanked her ceremoniously, bowed to her husband, and rode away. An hour later, after nightfall, he repassed the plantation, going northward in the direction from which he had come. He was a federal scout. As Peyton Farquhar fell straight down through the bridge, he lost consciousness and was as one already dead. From this state, he was awakened, ages later it seemed to him, by the pain of a sharp pressure upon his throat, followed by a sense of suffocation. Keen, poignant agonies seemed to shoot from his neck downward through every fiber of his body and limbs. These pains appeared to flash along well-defined lines of ramification and to beat with an inconceivably rapid periodicity. They seemed like streams of pulsating fire heating him to an intolerable temperature. As to his head, he was conscious of nothing but feeling a fullness of congestion. The sensations were unaccompanied by thought. The intellectual part of his nature was already effaced. He had power to only feel, and the feeling was torment. He was conscious of motion, encompassed in a luminous cloud of which he was now merely the fiery heart. Without material substance, he swung through unthinkable arcs of oscillation, like a vast pendulum. Then, all at once, with terrible suddenness, the light about him shot upward with the noise of a loud splash. A frightening roar was in his ears, and all was cold and dark. The power of thought was restored. He knew that the rope had broken, and he had fallen into the stream. There was no additional strangulation. The noose about his neck was already suffocating him, and kept the water from his lungs. To die of hanging at the bottom of a river, the idea seemed to him ludicrous. He opened his eyes in the darkness and saw above him a gleam of light, but how distant, how inaccessible. He was still sinking, for the light became fainter and fainter, until it was a mere glimmer. Then it began to grow and brighten, and he knew he was rising towards the surface, knew it with reluctance. For now he was very comfortable. To be hanged and drowned, he thought, that is not so bad. But I do not wish to be shot. No, I will not be shot. That is not fair. He was not conscious of an effort, but a sharp pain in his wrist apprised him that he was trying to free his hands. He gave the struggle his attention, as an idler might observe the feat of a juggler, without interest in the outcome. What a splendid effort! What magnificent, what superhuman strength! Ah, what an endeavor! Bravo! The cord fell away. His arms parted and floated upward, his hands dimly seen on each side in the growing light. He watched them with a new interest as the first one and then the other pounced on the noose at his neck. They tore it away and thrust it fiercely aside, its undulations resembling those of a water snake. Put it back! Put it back! He thought he shouted these words to his hands, for the undoing of the noose had been succeeded by the direst pang that he had yet experienced. His neck ached horribly, his brain was on fire, his heart, which had been fluttering faintly, gave a great leap, trying to force itself out at his mouth. His whole body racked and wrenched with insupportable anguish, but his disobedient hands gave no heed to the command. They beat the water vigorously with quick downward strokes, forcing him to the surface. He felt his head emerge. His eyes were blinded by the sunlight. His chest expanded convulsively. With a supreme and crowning agony, his lungs engulfed a great draught of air, which instantly he expelled in a shriek. He was now in full possession of his physical senses. They were, indeed, preternaturally keen and alert. Something in the awful disturbance of his organic system had so exalted and refined them that they made record of things never before perceived. He felt the ripples upon his face and heard their separate sounds as they struck. He looked at the forest on the bank of the stream, saw the individual trees, the leaves and the veining of each leaf. He saw the insects upon them, the locusts, the brilliant-bodied flies, the gray spiders stretching their webs from twig to twig. He noted the prismatic colors in all the dewdrops upon a million blades of grass, the humming of the gnats that danced above the eddies of the stream, the beating of the dragonfly's wings, the strokes of the water spider's legs, like oars which had lifted their boat. All of these made audible music. A fish sliding along beneath his eyes, and he heard the rush of his body parting the water. He had come to the surface facing down the stream. In a moment, the visible world seemed to wheel slowly around him, himself the pivotal point, and he saw the bridge, the fort, the soldiers upon the bridge, the captain, the sergeant, the two privates, his executioners. They were in silhouette against the blue sky. They shouted, gesticulated, pointing at him. The captain had drawn his pistol but did not fire. The others were unarmed. Their movements were grotesque and horrible, their forms gigantic. Suddenly, he heard a sharp report, and something struck the water smartly within a few inches of his head, spattering his face with spray. He heard a second report, and saw one of the sentinels with his rifle at his shoulder, a light cloud of blue smoke rising from the muzzle. The man in the water saw the eye of the man on the bridge, gazing into his own through the sights of the rifle. He observed that it was a gray eye, remembering having read that gray eyes were the keenest, and that all famous marksmen had them. Nevertheless, this one had missed. A counter swirl had caught Farquhar and turned him half around. He was looking again into the forest on the bank opposite the fort. The sound of a clear, high voice in a monotonous sing-song now rang out behind him and came across the water with a distinctness that pierced and subdued all other sounds, even the beating of the ripples in his ears. Although no soldier, he had frequented camps enough to know the dreadful significance of that deliberate, drawling, aspirated chant. The lieutenant was on the shore taking part in the morning's work. How coldly and pitilessly, with what an even, calm intonation, presaging and enforcing tranquility in the men, with what accurately measured intervals fell those cruel words. "Attention company, shoulder arms, ready, aim, fire." Farquhar dived as deeply as he could. The water roared in his ears like the voice of Niagara, yet he heard the dulled thunder of the volley, and the rising again to the surface met his shining bits of metal, singularly flattened, oscillating slowly downward. Some of them touched him on the face and hands, then fell away, continuing their descent. One lodged between his collar and neck. It was uncomfortably warm, and he snatched it out. As he rose to the surface, gasping for breath, he saw that he had been a long time underwater. He was precipitably farther downstream, nearer to safety. The soldiers had almost finished reloading. The metal ramrods flashed all at once in the shine as they were drawn from the barrels, turned in the air, and thrust into their sockets. The two sentinels fired again, independently and ineffectually. The hunted man saw all of this over his shoulder. He was now swimming vigorously with the current. His brain was energetic as his arms and legs. He thought with the rapidity of lightning. The officer, he reasoned, will not make that marionette's error a second time. It is easy to dodge a volley as a single shot. He has probably already given the command to fire at will. God help me, I cannot dodge them all. An appalling splash within 2 yards was followed by a loud rushing sound, diminuendo, which seemed to travel back through the air to the fort and died in an explosion which stirred the very river to its deeps. A rising sheet of water curved over him, fell down upon him, blinded him, strangled him. The cannon had not taken a hand in the game. As he shook his head free from the commotion of the smitten water, he heard the deflected shot humming through the air, and in an instant it was crackling and smashing the branches in the forest beyond. They will not do that again, he thought. The next time they will use a charge of grape. I must keep my eye upon the gun. The smoke will apprise me. The report arrives too late. It lags behind the missile. That is a good gun. Suddenly he felt himself whirled round and round, spinning like a top. The water, the banks, the forest, the now distant bridge, fort and men, all were commingled and blurred. Objects were represented by their colors only, circular horizontal streaks of color. That was all he saw. He had been caught in a vortex and was being whirled on the velocity of advance and gyration that made him giddy and sick. In a few moments he was flung upon the gravel of the foot of the left bank of the stream, the southern bank, and behind a projecting point which concealed him from his enemies. The sudden arrest of his motion, the abrasion of one of his hands on the gravel, restored him, and he wept with delight. He dug his fingers into the sand, threw it over himself in handfuls, and audibly blessed it. It looked like diamonds, rubies, emeralds. He could think of nothing beautiful which it did not resemble. The trees upon the banks were giant garden plants. He noted a definite order in their arrangement, inhaled the fragrance of their blooms. A strange roseate light shone through the spaces among their trunks, and the wind made their branches the music of Aeolian harps. He had no wish to perfect his escape. He was content to remain in that enchanting spot until retaken. A whiz and rattle of grape shot among the branches above his head roused him from this dream. The baffled cannoneer had fired him a random farewell. He sprang to his feet, rushed to the sloping bank, and plunged into the forest. All that day he traveled, laying his course by the rounding sun. The forest seemed interminable. Nowhere did he discover a break in it, not even a woodman's road. He had not known that he had lived in so wild a region. There was something uncanny in the revelation. By nightfall he was fatigued, footsore, famished. The thought of his wife and children urged him on. At last he found a road which led him in what he knew to be the right direction. It was as wide and straight as a city street, yet it seemed untraveled. No fields bordered it, no dwelling anywhere. Not so much as the barking of a dog suggested human habitation. The black bodies of the trees formed a straight wall on both sides, terminating on the horizon point, like a diagram in a lesson in perspective. Overhead, as he looked through the rift in this wood, shone great garden stars, looking unfamiliar and grouped in strange constellations. He was sure they were arranged in some order which had a secret and malign significance. The wood on either side was full of singular noises, among which, once, twice, and again, he distinctly heard whispers in an unknown tongue. His neck was in pain, and lifting his hand to it, found it horribly swollen. He knew that it had a circle of black where the rope had bruised it. His eyes felt congested. He could no longer close them. His tongue was swollen with thirst. He relieved its fever by thrusting it forward in between his teeth into the cold air. How softly the turf had carpeted the untraveled avenue. He could no longer feel the roadway beneath his feet. Doubtless, despite his suffering, he had fallen asleep while walking, for now he sees another scene. Perhaps he has merely recovered from a delirium. He stands at the gate of his own home. All is as he left it, and all bright and beautiful in the morning sunshine. He must have traveled the entire night. As he pushes open the gate and passes up the wide white walk, he sees a flutter of female garments. His wife, looking fresh and cool and sweet, stepped down from the veranda to meet him. At the bottom of the steps, she stands waiting, with a smile of ineffable joy, an attitude of matchless grace and dignity. Ah, how beautiful she is. He springs forward with extended arms. As he's about to clasp her, he feels a stunning blow upon the back of his neck. A blinding white light blazes all about him with a sound like the shock of a cannon. Then all is darkness and silence. Peyton Farquhar was dead. His body, with a broken neck, swung gently from side to side, beneath the timbers of the Owl Creek Bridge.